We are back. I just want to make sure that this is operating properly. Do I get to see myself? Oh, there I am. All right. Okay. We are going through notes for The Brain That Changed Itself. This is part one. References, resources. This is going to be pertaining to neuroplasticity and adaptation. See principles. Okay. Let's get something in here. Maybe like one of these. Can I do this? Oh yeah. So I think I might just add notes in here for. So let's get rid of that. Let's do the brain that changes itself. Deutsch. And then we can talk here. But yeah, I think what we're going to do on this side is, and the question is, does it have this? Okay, we've got table of contents, Copilot. Come on. Oh no, do we not have another? You know what? I think I did get another reader of some sort. Do we not have a single other reader? All right, we're not running. We're not opening it with Vim. No. Oh man. I don't quite remember what we did. I could just kind of scroll through and look for any quotes like this. All right, neuro is for neuron, the nerve cells in our brains and nervous systems. Plastic is for changeable, malleable, and modifiable. At first, many of the scientists didn't dare use the word neuroplasticity in their publications, and their peers belittled them for promoting a fanciful notion. Yet they persisted, slowly overturning the doctrine of the unchanging brain. They showed that children are not always stuck with the mental abilities they are born with, that the damaged brain can often reorganize itself so that when one part fails, another can often substitute, that if brain cells die, they can at times be replaced, that many circuits and even basic reflexes that we think are hardwired are not. One of these scientists even showed that thinking, learning, and acting can turn our genes on or off, thus shaping our brain anatomy and our behavior. That we cover in the document with epigenetics. Surely one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the 20th century. While the human brain has apparently underestimated itself, neuroplasticity isn't all good. That's a cool phrase. The human brain has apparently underestimated itself. Neuroplasticity isn't all good news. It renders our brains not only more resourceful, but also more vulnerable to outside influences. Huge. Okay, so this is actually an idea that we should. I want to just gank that whole. I don't know why I didn't. This is like a. This is like a fundamental type of quote for the document here, because we want to point out that the neuroplasticity, just the fact of it, is what allows us to do everything that we want to do in this document. Like the point is that we can do things that change the brain in such a way where we experience the world differently in the future. And that's like a very, obvious thing. It's very simple. Even when I read something, I'm doing that. And whenever I study something, I'm doing that. But yeah, we want to make sure that we are aware of all the types of change that can happen. It's not all just learning. We need to be aware of biases. We need to be aware of addiction. Our habits of thought. Like this is something. This is something pervasive. resourceful, but also more vulnerable to outside influences. All right, neuroplasticity has the power to produce more flexible but also more rigid behaviors, a phenomenon I call the plastic paradox. Ironically, some of our most stubborn habits and disorders are products of our plasticity. Once a particular plastic change occurs in the brain and becomes well established, it can prevent other changes from occurring. It is by understanding both the positive and negative effects of plasticity that we can truly understand the extent of human possibilities. So, yeah, this is, even though I'm writing these notes down in the part 1 section on neuroplasticity, this is really important for part 2 stuff, where we're actually leveraging our reflective thought to specifically direct the trajectory of our plastic brains. Okay, so let's keep going. Did I have... What is the best way to do this without having thumbnails that help us out here? Do we have thumbnails at all? Could we just get... You know what? We could do this. Yeah. Yeah. Also, we could just do this. We could go... Yeah, yep. All right. There we go. What are we looking for here? This can happen because all our sense receptors translate different kinds of energy from the external world, no matter what the source, into electrical patterns that are sent down our nerves. Right, we could just think of different, our sensory organs. They're taking in, some sort of energy. Like you could think of air waves as kinetic energy of some sort. But then these are translated into the specific electrical patterns. Okay, so I actually modified this. No, I modified this word electric. Yeah, it should be electrical. How do I get back now? We're back. Okay. Right, and the electrical patterns are the specific communication of neurotransmitters that we've discussed. These electrical patterns are the universal language spoken inside the brain. There are no visual images, sounds, smells, or feelings moving inside our neurons. Bach-y-Rita realized that the areas that process these electrical impulses are far more homogeneous than neuroscientists appreciated, a belief that was reinforced when the neuroscientist Vernon Mountcastle discovered that the visual, auditory, and sensory cortices all have a similar 6-layer processing structure. To Bach-y-Rita, this meant that any part of the cortex should be able to process whatever electrical signals were sent to it, and that our brain modules were not so specialized after all. Well, just because you could see somewhat similar structures doesn't mean that those structures can then become quite complex and differentiate themselves. All right, so what's our next? Oh, we're making moves. We're getting pretty far here. The irony of this new discovery is that for hundreds of years, educators did seem to sense that children's brains had to be built up through exercises of increasing difficulty that strengthened brain functions. Up through the 19th and early 20th centuries, a classical education often included rote memorization of long poems in foreign languages, which strengthened the auditory memory, hence thinking in language, and an almost fanatical attention to handwriting, which probably helped strengthen motor capacities and thus not only helped handwriting, but added speed and fluency to reading and speaking. Often a great deal of attention was paid to exact elocution and to perfecting the pronunciation of words. Then in the 1960s, educators dropped such traditional exercises from the curriculum because they were too rigid, boring, and not relevant. But the loss of these drills has been costly. They may have been the only opportunity that many students had to systematically exercise the brain function that gives us fluency and grace with symbols. For the rest of us, their disappearances may have contributed to the general decline of eloquence, which requires memory and a level of auditory brain power unfamiliar to us now. Okay. This work compels us to imagine how much good might be accomplished if every child had a brain-based assessment and, if problems were found, a tailor-made program created to strengthen essential areas in the early years when neuroplasticity is greatest. It is far better to nip brain problems in the bud than to allow the child to wire into its brain the idea that he is stupid, begin to hate school and learning, and stop work in the weakened area, losing whatever strength they may have. Younger children often progress more quickly through brain exercises than do adolescents, perhaps because in an immature brain, the number of connections among neurons, or synapses, is 50% greater than in the adult brain. When we reach adolescence, a massive pruning back operation begins in the brain, and synaptic connections and neurons that have not been used extensively suddenly die off. A classic case of use it or lose it. It is probably best to strengthen weakened areas while all this extra cortical real estate is available. So I'm going to gank that quote. That's a big one, and it also touches up on stuff we say in this subsection. Still, brain-based assessments can be helpful all through school and even in college and university, when many students who did well in high school fail because their weak brain functions are overloaded by the increased demand. Yikes. Even apart from these crises, every adult could benefit from a brain-based cognitive assessment, a cognitive fitness test, to help them better understand their own brain. Interesting. All right, for people, post-mortem examinations have shown that education increases the number of branches among neurons. An increased number of branches drives the neurons further apart, leading to an increase in the volume and thickness of the brain. The idea that the brain is like a muscle that grows with exercise is not just a metaphor. Right, but I don't know, I forget when this came out, but we definitely got rid of the idea that a bigger brain means smarter. What are we at here? Oh, come on, is it not going to tell us? I might have to look it up. Am I taking recommendations today? I don't think so. I think we might just be reading through this thing because otherwise it'll just take a long time for us to get through it. And I don't think anyone wants that. But if it, yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe then. What does it pertain to? Okay, the brain that changes itself. This is 2007. Wow. 20 years ago. A long time. All right. Has described him as the world's leading researcher. Okay. Specialty is improving people's ability to think and perceive by redesigning the brain by training specific processing areas called brain maps so that they do more mental work. Of neuroplasticians with solid hard science credentials, it is Merzenich who has made the most ambitious claims for the field, that brain exercises may be as useful as drugs to treat diseases as severe as schizophrenia, that plasticity exists from the cradle to the grave, and that radical improvements in cognitive functioning, how we learn, think, perceive, and remember, are possible even in the elderly. Okay. The cerebral cortex, he says, of the thin outer layer of the brain is actually selectively refining its processing capacities to fit each task at hand. It doesn't simply learn, It is always learning how to learn. The brain, Merzenich describes, is not an inanimate vessel that we fill. Rather, it is more like a living creature with an appetite, one that can grow and change itself with proper nourishment and exercise. Before Merzenich's work, the brain was seen as a complex machine having unalterable limits on memory, processing speed, and intelligence. One of the great discoveries Penfield made was that sensory and motor brain maps, like geographical maps, are topographical, meaning that areas adjacent to each other on the body's surface are generally adjacent to each other on the brain maps. He also discovered that when he touched certain parts of the brain, he triggered long lost childhood memories or dreamlike scenes, which implied that higher mental activities were also mapped in the brain. This is when we're first discovering this stuff. It's related to Francisco Varela. Okay, I gotta look this up again. Living systems, self-producing, that continuously regenerate. Okay. I mean, I guess so. If we do it briefly, if that's all right. Also, just to point out, this is like neuroplasticity falls within autopoiesis. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Pronunciation. I think it is. That and like homeostasis, like neuroplasticity is part of that.
Autopoiesis.
Poiesis? So not poiesis, poiesis?
Autopoiesis.
Poi, okay. Autopoiesis. Okay, they'd insert microelectrodes into the visual cortex of kittens and discovered that different parts of the cortex processed the lines, orientations, and movements of visually perceived objects. They also discovered that there was a critical period from the 3rd to the 8th week of life when the newborn kitten's brain had to receive visual stimulation in order to develop normally. In the crucial experiment, Hubel and Wiesel sewed shut one eyelid of a kitten during its critical period, so the eye got no visual stimulation. When they opened this shut eye, they found that the visual areas in the brain map that normally processed input from the shut eye had failed to develop, leaving the kitten blind in that eye for life. Clearly, the brains of kittens during the critical period were plastic, their structure literally shaped by experience. That is insane. Begs the question, what are those for us, for humans? When Hubel and Wiesel examined the brain map for that blind eye, they made one more unexpected discovery about plasticity. The part of the kitten's brain that had been deprived of input from the shut eye did not remain idle. It had begun to process visual input from the open eye, as though the brain didn't want to waste any cortical real estate and had found a way to rewire itself, another indication that the brain is plastic in the critical period. For this work, they received the Nobel Prize. Yet even though they had discovered plasticity in infancy, they remained localizationists, defending the idea that the adult brain is hardwired by the end of infancy to perform functions in fixed locations. The discovery of the critical period became one of the most famous in biology in the second half of the 20th century. Scientists soon showed that other brain systems required environmental stimuli to develop. It also seemed that each neural system had a different critical period or window of time during which it was especially plastic and sensitive to the environment, and during which it had rapid formative growth. Language development, for instance, has a critical period that begins in infancy and ends between 8 years and puberty. After this critical period closes, a person's ability to learn a second language without an accent is limited. In fact, second languages learned after the critical period are not processed in the same part of the brain as is the native tongue. That's crazy. I wonder if you could use psychedelics to get around that. I don't know if that's like a crazy thought, but all right, when we say that neurons rewire themselves, we mean that alterations occur at the synapse, strengthening and increasing, or weakening and decreasing the number of connections between the neurons. When a large peripheral nerve, which consists of many axons, is cut, sometimes in the process of regeneration, the wires get crossed. When axons reattach to the axons of the wrong nerve, the person may experience false localization, so that a touch on the index finger is felt in the thumb. Scientists assume that this false localization occurred because the regeneration process shuffled the nerves, sending the signal from the index finger to the brain map for the thumb. The model scientists had of the brain and the nervous system was that each point on the body's surface had a nerve that passed signals directly to a specific point on the brain map, anatomically hardwired at birth. Thus, a nerve branch for the thumb will always pass its signals directly to that spot on the sensory brain map for the thumb. Merzenich and the group accepted this point-to-point model of the brain map and innocently set out to document what was happening in the brain during this shuffling of nerves. They micromapped the hand maps in the brains of several adolescent monkeys, cut a peripheral nerve to the hand, and immediately sewed the two severed ends close together, but not quite touching, hoping that many axonal wires in the nerve would get crossed as the nerve regenerated itself. After 7 months, they remapped the brain. Merzenich assumed that they would see a very disturbed, chaotic brain map. Thus, if the nerves for the thumb and the index finger had been crossed, he expected that touching the index finger would generate activity in the map area for the thumb. But he saw nothing of the kind. The map was almost normal. What we saw, he said, was absolutely astounding. I couldn't understand it. It was topographically arranged as though the brain had unshuffled the signals from the crossed nerves. This breakthrough week changed Merzenich's life. He realized that he and mainstream neuroscience had fundamentally misinterpreted how the human brain forms maps to represent the body and the world. If the brain map could normalize its structure in response to abnormal input, the prevailing view that we are born with a hardwired system had to be wrong. The brain had to be plastic. After some time, he repeated the experiment, stimulating the monkey in the same spot, only to find that the movement produced often changed. As Harvard's great historian of psychology of the time, Edwin G. Boring, wow, put it, one day's mapping would no longer be valid on tomorrow. Maps were dynamic. Saw the revolutionary implications. All right, so I think that's just given the lead up to explaining how we arrived at the idea that the brain was that the brain is plastic. The experiment demonstrated that if the median nerve was cut, other nerves, still brimming with electrical input, would take over the unused map space to process their input. When it came to allocating brain, so yeah, that's kind of interesting. Like, you'd imagine if there were neurons that were cut, that signal still has to go somewhere, so it's distributed amongst the axon dendrite connections that weren't cut, effectively boosting those. But then how would it arrive at the same spot? That's, I guess, yeah, I guess I don't know enough about the brain, but also I feel like this gets to be really complicated. Like, we start seeing like almost like circuit logic between neurons and actually maybe not circuit logic, but we just start seeing like logic patterns that result in the signal going in a certain direction, even when you cut connections in the path, that the signals would still go in that certain direction. I wonder if it's because of like priors. Like we had this discussion about how signals get to the dendrite in two different locations. You know, you could think of some coming from like a source that's offering the predictive component and one source that's offering like the actual like stimuli input component, and these kind of at some point reach, and if they're like in line with each other, then that affects the activation of those that neuron in a certain way, like the phase transition that we've discussed. All right, the experiment demonstrated that if the median nerve was cut, other nerves still brimming with electrical input would take over the unused map space to process their input. When it came to allocating brain processing power, brain maps were governed by competition for precious resources and the principle of use it or lose it. The competitive nature of plasticity affects us all. There is an endless war of nerves going on inside each of our brains. If we stop exercising our mental skills, we do not just forget them. The brain map space for those skills, is turned over to the skills we practice instead. If you ever ask yourself, how often must I practice French or guitar or math to keep on top of it? You're asking a question about competitive plasticity. You are asking how frequently you must practice one activity to make sure its brain map space is not lost to another. Competitive plasticity in adults even explains some of our limitations. Think of the difficulty most adults have in learning a second language. The conventional view now is that the difficulty arises because the critical period for language learning has ended, leaving us with a brain too rigid to change its structure on a large scale. But the discovery of competitive plasticity suggests there is more to it. As we age, the more we use our native language, the more it comes to dominate our linguistic map space. Thus, it is also because our brain is plastic and because plasticity is competitive that it is so hard to learn a new language and end the tyranny of the mother tongue. But why? If this is true, is it easier to learn a second language when we are young? Is there not competition then too? Not really. If two languages are learned at the same time during the critical period, both get a foothold. Brain scans, say Merzenich, show that in a bilingual child, all the sounds of its two languages share a single large map, a library of sounds from both languages. Competitive plasticity also explains why our bad habits are so difficult to break or unlearn. Most of us think of the brain as a container and learning as putting something in it. When we try to break a bad habit, we think the solution is to put something new into the container. But when we learn a bad habit, it takes over a brain map. And each time we repeat it, it claims more control of that map and prevents the use of that space for good habits. That is why unlearning is often a lot harder than learning, and why early childhood education is so important. It's best to get it right early before the bad habit gets a competitive advantage. Okay. All right, the next experiment, he mapped a monkey's hand map in the brain. Then he amputated that monkey's middle finger. So this is, I guess, prior to when there were any like rights for animal test subjects. That being said, you know, with like Neuralink, it's not like they have, you know, the rights today. I would rather lose my finger than be tortured. After a number of months, he remapped the monkey and found that the brain map for the amputated finger had disappeared and that the maps for the adjacent fingers had grown into the space that had originally mapped for the middle finger. Here was the clearest possible demonstration that brain maps are dynamic, that there is a competition for cortical real estate, and that brain resources are allocated according to the principle of use it or lose it. Merzenich also, no, it's probably like Merzenich, also noted that animals of a particular species may have similar maps, but they are never identical. Micromapping allowed him to see differences that Penfield, with larger electrodes, could not. He also found that the maps of normal body parts change every few weeks. Every time he mapped a normal monkey's face, it was unequivocally different. Plasticity doesn't require the provocation of cut nerves or amputations. Plasticity is a normal phenomenon, and brain maps are constantly changing. When he wrote up this new experiment, he finally took the word plasticity out of quotes. Yet despite the elegance of his experiment, opposition to his ideas did not melt away overnight. He received hostile treatment. I don't know how else to put it. I got people saying things in reviews such as this would be really interesting if it could possibly be true, but it could not be. It was as if I just made it up. All right. It seemed reasonable to assume that if totally new maps were forming, then new connections must have been forming among neurons. To help understand this process, Merzenich invoked the ideas of Donald O. Hebb, a Canadian behavioral psychologist who had worked with Penfield. In 1949, Hebb proposed that learning linked neurons in new ways. Proposed that learning had linked neurons in new ways. Learning links new neurons in new ways, or had linked. I feel like you wouldn't say learning linked new neurons in new ways. He proposed that when two neurons fire at the same time repeatedly, or when one fires causing another to fire, chemical changes occur in both, so that the two tend to connect more strongly. Hebb's concept, actually proposed by Freud 60 years before, was neatly summarized by neuroscientist Carla Schatz. Neurons that fire together wire together. So this is a pretty intuitive concept. Like, you can imagine that signals in the brain are localized in some sense. Like, they're just like, imagine just going down a path of connections, and there would be a similar type of neurochemical process happening as these synapses or as these neurons are fired and the synapses are strengthened. Like, it kind of makes pretty intuitive sense once you have the visual up of neurons connecting to other neurons. Can you please ask ChatGPT to explain the theory of didn't we go over autopoiesis like literally last week? I thought you were asking if that you had a recommendation related to it. Also, like, literally, if I just do this, like, this is AI. Describes living systems as self-producing. So, yeah, we definitely talked about autopoiesis, and then I went into a whole thing about how autopoiesis is similar to homeostasis, which we discussed. I don't think there's much new here. Coined by biologists Maturana and Varela. And Varela is, the neurophenomenology guy, right? As well, Francisco Varela, with Thompson, Varela and Thompson. Evan Thompson. Right. I feel like we've got that mapped out. Hebb's theory thus argued that neuronal structure can be altered by experience. Following Hebb, Merzenich's new theory was that neurons in brain maps develop strong connections to one another when they are activated at the same moment in time. And if maps could change, thought Merzenich, then, so, I mean, I guess it makes sense that it would have to be at the same time, but it's really that they're getting activated at a same, like at a same cadence, right? Like it wouldn't be necessarily that they are activated at the same time, like a singular time. It's that they're being activated recurrently at the same time. And if maps could change, thought Merzenich, then there was reason to hope that people born with problems in brain map processing areas, people with learning problems, psychological problems, strokes, or brain injuries, might be able to form new maps if he could help them form new neuronal connections by getting their healthy neurons to fire together and wire together. Huge deal here now. That, I mean, this is all what we're going to be doing in part 2 as well, like especially when trying to break habits or build habits. Like we're trying to get this fire together, wire together thing set up. If the experimenters touched any point on either finger, this new single map would light up. Because all the movements and sensations in those fingers always occurred simultaneously, they'd form the same map. The experiment showed that timing of the input to the neurons in the map was the key to forming it. Neurons that fired together in time wired together to make one map. Right, and it's not that they were both, activated separately, right? Like it does need to happen at the same time so that their externalities are like linked. In neuroscience, this finding is now summarized as neurons that fire apart wire apart, neurons out of sync fail to link. Wow. In the next experiment in the sequence, Merzenich created a map for what might be called a non-existent finger that ran perpendicular to the other fingers. The team stimulated all 5 fingertips of a monkey simultaneously, 500 times a day for over a month, preventing the monkey from using its fingers one at a time. Soon the monkey's brain map had a new elongated finger map in which the 5 fingertips were merged. This new map ran perpendicular to the other fingers, and all the fingertips were part of it instead of part of their individual finger maps, which had started to melt away from disuse. That's crazy. In the final and most brilliant demonstration, Merzenich and his team proved that maps cannot be anatomically based. They took a small patch of skin from one finger, and this is the key point, with the nerves to its brain map still attached, surgically grafted the skin onto an adjacent finger. How do you do that? How is that even possible? I don't understand. Now that piece of skin and its nerve were stimulated whenever the finger it was attached to was moved or touched in the course of daily use. According to the anatomical hardwiring model, the signals should still have been sent from the skin along its nerve to the brain map for the finger that the skin and nerve originally came from. Instead, when the team stimulated the patch of skin, the map of the new finger responded. The map for the patch of skin migrated from the brain map of the original finger to its new one because both the patch and the new finger were stimulated simultaneously. In a few short years, Merzenich had discovered that adult brains are plastic, persuaded skeptics in the scientific community that this was the case, and shown that experience changes the brain. But he still hadn't explained a crucial enigma: how the maps organize themselves to become topographically and function in a way that is useful to us. Okay. Topographical organization is efficient because it means that parts of the brain that often work together are close together in the brain map, so signals don't have to travel far in the brain itself. The question for Merzenich was, how does this topographic order emerge in the brain map? The answer he and his group came to was ingenious. A topographic order emerges because many of our everyday activities involve repeating sequences in a fixed order. Okay. Many of all brain maps work by spatially grouping together events that happen together. As we have seen, the auditory map is arranged like a piano, with mapping regions for low notes at one end and for high notes at the other. Why is it so orderly? Because the low frequencies of sound tend to come together with one another in nature. When we hear a person with a low voice, most of the frequencies are low, so they get grouped together. So I'm thinking that these are still like hypotheses. I don't quite remember. I did read this like 4 months ago, or maybe 6 months ago at this point. The experiment showed that when an animal is motivated to learn, the brain responds plastically. The experiment also showed that as brain maps get bigger, the individual neurons get more efficient in 2 stages. At first, as the monkey trained, the map for the fingertip grew to take up more space, but after a while, individual neurons within the map became more efficient, and eventually fewer neurons were required to perform that task. Okay. When a child learns to play piano scales for the first time, he tends to use his whole upper body, wrist, arm, shoulder, to play each note. Even the facial muscles tighten into a grimace. With practice, the budding pianist stops using irrelevant muscles and soon uses only the correct finger to play the note. He develops a lighter touch, and if he becomes skillful, he develops a grace and relaxes when he plays. This is because the child goes from using a massive number of neurons to an appropriate few, well matched to the task. Okay. Merzenich and Jenkins also found that as neurons are trained to become more efficient, they can process faster. This means that the speed at which we think is itself plastic. Probably to an extent. Given that we have like a clock speed, right? Isn't this what we've talked about a few times? We seem to have like a human set clock speed, so even if if connections are changing in the brain, the signal is happening at similar frequencies, which we know about, right? We know those different frequencies, the different brain waves. They also discovered that as they trained an animal at a skill, not only did its neurons fire faster, but because they were faster, their signals were clearer. Faster neurons were more likely to fire in sync with each other, becoming better team players, wiring together more and forming groups of neurons that gave off clearer and more powerful signals. This is a crucial point because a powerful signal has greater impact on the brain. When we want to remember something we have heard, we must hear it clearly, because a memory can be only as clear as its original signal. Finally, Merzenich discovered that paying close attention is essential to long-term plastic change. In numerous experiments, he found that lasting change occurred only when his monkeys paid close attention. So this is the first we're getting of how important attention is to, especially to learning. Okay, so we've got a nice break here. The fact that a visual component of the IQ went up meant that the IQ improvements were not caused simply because Fast for Word improved the children's ability to read verbal test questions. Their mental processing was being improved in a general way, possibly because their temporal processing was improving. So I think Fast for Word is like an online cognitive function set of games. Like, it's one of those cognitive improvement games. Now, I think they have some data that it showed that it did some things more so than the usual, like, you just get better at that game. Like, I've heard Jordan Peterson say that a bunch where we've kind of learned that these types of cognitive booster games, brain games, just improve your ability at those things. But the types of studies that they were using for this, if I recall correctly, were testing other types of cognitive exercises that you would think are both unrelated and also useful, something that you would want. So the question is there something about this that was particularly useful or not, maybe salient? Or was this a part of the reproducibility crisis, and perhaps this isn't reflected afterwards? I do believe I did make a Gemini research on what has happened since, and maybe we want to regenerate that, because I generated it using 2.5, but maybe we want to do that. We want to generate it using 3. So fortunately I still have the prompt somewhere, but we'll get to that after we're done reading through the book. But another pilot study of 100 autistic children showed that Fast for Word had a significant impact on their autistic symptoms as well. Their attention spans improved. Their sense of humor improved. They became more connected to people. They developed better eye contact, began greeting people and addressing them by name, spoke with them, and said goodbye at the end of their encounters. It seemed the children were beginning to experience the world as filled with other human minds. Okay. Okay, where are we at here? He has come to think it likely that an environmental factor affects the neural circuits in these children, forcing the critical periods to shut down early before the brain maps are fully differentiated. When we are born, our brain maps are often rough drafts or sketches, lacking detail, undifferentiated. In the critical period, when the structure of our brain maps is generally getting shaped by our first worldly experiences, the rough draft normally becomes detailed and differentiated. Merzenich and his team used micromapping to show how maps in newborn rats are formed in the critical period. Right after birth, at the beginning of the critical period, auditory maps were undifferentiated, with only 2 broad regions in the cortex. Half of the map responded to any high-frequency sound. The other half responded to any low-frequency sound. When the animal was exposed to a particular frequency during the critical period, that simple organization changed. If the animal was repeatedly exposed to a high C, after a while only a few neurons would turn on, becoming selective for high C. The same would happen to when. So you see, like, I wish when I was a kid I learned perfect pitch. That would have been pretty nice. After the critical period, older children and adults can, of course, learn languages, but they really have to work to pay attention. For Merzenich, the difference between critical period plasticity and adult plasticity is that in the critical period, the brain maps can be changed just by being exposed to the world because the learning machinery is continuously on. And for adults, we have to pay close attention in order to turn that plasticity on. And that's one of the reasons why immersing yourself in a place with a language can make it much more salient that you remember or apply language in a certain way. The stakes are a lot higher. Like that is, you set your baseline where that is one of the most important things that you could be paying attention to. When we perform an activity that requires specific neurons to fire together, they release BDNF. Do we know what BDNF is? How far away are we from where this was defined? Brain-derived neurotropic factor is a crucial protein in the brain that acts like fertilizer for neurons, supporting their survival, growth, and the formation of new connections. Vital for learning, memory, and mood regulation. Okay. When we perform an activity that requires specific neurons to fire together, they release BDNF. This growth factor consolidates the connections between those neurons and helps to wire them together so they fire together reliably in the future. BDNF also promotes the growth of the thin, fatty coat around every neuron that speeds up the transmission of electrical signals. During the critical period, BDNF turns on the nucleus basalis, I'm guessing. Basalis? No, basalis? I don't know. The part of our brain that allows us to focus our attention and keeps it on throughout the entire critical period. Wow. Once turned on, the nucleus basalis helps us not only pay attention, but remember what we are experiencing. It allows map differentiation and change to take place effortlessly. Merzenich told me it is like a teacher in the brain saying, now this is really important. This is what you have to know for the exam of life. So when you're in that critical period during, your developmental years, you're constantly in that state, I guess, or at least your brain is. The fourth and final service that BDNF performs when it has completed strengthening key connections is to help close down the critical period. So the critical period here is not talking about specifically the developmental critical period, but it's talking about when we're, like, any time that as adults we're even applying our attention to something. We're talking about a critical period in that moment of focus, and how that will help us actually internalize information. Once the main neuronal connections are laid down, there is a need for stability and hence less plasticity in the system. Okay. Henceforth, the nucleus can be activated only when something important, surprising, or novel occurs, or if we make the effort to pay close attention. Huge. Rzenich's work on the critical period and BDNF helped him develop a theory that explains how so many different problems could be part of a single autistic whole. During the critical period, he argues, some situations overexcite the neurons in children who have genes that predispose them to autism, leading to the massive premature release of BDNF. Instead of important connections being reinforced, all connections are. So much BDNF is released that it turns off the critical period prematurely, sealing all those connections in place, and the child is left with scores of undifferentiated brain maps and hence pervasive developmental disorders. Their brains are hyper-excitable and hypersensitive. If they hear one frequency, the whole auditory cortex starts firing. Wow. Several studies alerted him to how an environmental factor might contribute. One disturbing study showed that the closer children lived to the noisy airport in Frankfurt, Germany, the lower their intelligence was. How crazy is that? So, like, because when you're a child, your brain is hyperplastic. The fact that there was so much noise led to connections being made that were now unable to be made, I guess, for the sake of your intelligence. If BDNF release was contributing to autism and language problems, Merzenich needed to understand what might cause young neurons to get overexcited and release massive amounts of the chemical. Several studies alerted him to how an environmental factor might contribute. One disturbing study showed that the closer children lived to the noisy airport in Frankfurt, Germany, the lower their intelligence was. A similar study on children in public housing high-rises above the Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago found that the closer their floor was to the highway, the lower their intelligence. So Merzenich began wondering about the role of a new environmental risk factor that might affect everyone, but have a more damaging effect on genetically predisposed children. The continuous background noise from machines, sometimes called white noise. White noise consists of many frequencies and is very stimulating to the auditory cortex. Infants are reared in continuously more noisy environments. There is always a din. A din? He says white noise is everywhere now, coming from fans in our electronics, air conditioners, heaters, and car engines. How would such noise affect the developing brain? Merzenich wondered. To test this hypothesis, his group exposed rat pups to pulses of white noise throughout their critical period and found that the pups' cortices were devastated. Every time you have a pulse, Merzenich says, you are exciting everything in the auditory cortex, every neuron. So many neurons firing results in a massive BDNF release, and as his model predicted, this exposure brings the critical period to a premature close. The animals are left with undifferentiated brain maps and utterly indiscriminate neurons that get turned on by any frequency. Okay, so yeah, it's not exactly what I said. It's not that like the space is getting used up. It's that the plasticity window is being closed too early, so you're probably unable to get as much information in there, or not just information, but you're just as much development in there in the direction of what we consider to be intelligence, whatever those procedures are. Now, the question for Merzenich was, could anything be done to normalize undifferentiated brain maps after the critical period? If he and his team could do so, they could offer hope for autistic children. Using white noise, they first differentiated the auditory maps of rats. Then, after the damage was done, they normalized and redifferentiated the maps using very simple tones, one at a time. With training, in fact, they brought the maps to an above normal range. And that, says Merzenich, is exactly what we are trying to do in these autistic children. He is currently developing a modification of 4-word that is designed for autism, a refinement of the program that helped Laura Lee. So the question is, would there be like a brain activity, like a game or something, that allows you to redifferentiate these maps so that you don't get these huge BDNF releases, and thus allowing the children to learn more effectively and for longer, I guess. They inserted microelectrodes into the nucleus basalis and used an electric current to keep it turned on. Then they exposed the rats to a 9 hertz sound frequency to see if they could effortlessly develop a brain map location for it, the way pups do during the critical period. After a week, they found they could massively expand the brain map for that particular sound frequency. They had found an artificial way to reopen the critical period in adults. They then used the same technique to get the brain to speed up its processing time. Normally, an adult rat's auditory neurons can only respond to tones at a maximum of 12 pulses per second. By stimulating the nucleus basalis, it was possible to educate the neurons to respond to ever more rapid inputs. Nice. This work opened up the possibility of high-speed learning later in life. The nucleus basalis could be turned on by an electrode, by micro-injections of certain chemicals, or by drugs. It is hard to imagine that people will not, for better or for worse, be drawn to a technology that would make it relatively effortless to master the facts of science, history, or a profession merely by being exposed to them briefly. Okay. The mainstream approach doesn't take into account what is required to maintain a sharp memory. A major reason memory loss occurs as we age is that we have trouble registering new events in our nervous systems because processing speed slows down, so that the accuracy, strength, and sharpness with which we perceive declines. If you can't register something clearly, you won't be able to remember it well. Take one of the most common problems of aging, trouble finding words. Merzenich thinks this problem can occur because of the gradual neglect and atrophy of the brain's attentional system and nucleus basalis, which have to be engaged for plastic change to occur. This atrophy leads to our representing oral speech with fuzzy engrams, meaning that the representation of sounds or words is not sharp because the neurons that encode these fuzzy engrams are not firing in the coordinated, quick way needed to send a powerful, sharp signal. Because the neurons that represent speech pass on fuzzy signals to all the neurons downstream from them, muddy in, muddy out, we also have trouble remembering, finding, and using words. It is similar to the problem we saw occurring in the brains of language impaired children who also have noisy brains. Okay. Psychologically, middle age is often an appealing time because, all else being equal, it can be a relatively placid period compared with what has come before. Our bodies aren't changing as they did in adolescence. We're more likely to have a solid sense of who we are and be skilled at a career. We still regard ourselves as active, but we have a tendency to deceive ourselves into thinking that we are learning as we were before. We rarely engage in tasks in which we must focus our attention as closely as we did when we were younger, trying to learn a new vocabulary or master new skills. Such activities as reading the newspaper, practicing a profession of many years, and speaking our own language are mostly the replay of mastered skills, not learning. By the time we hit our 70s, we may not have systematically engaged the systems in the brain that regulate plasticity for 50 years. Woo! Hopefully what we're doing on this channel is activating those parts of our brain. Okay. The same applies to mobility. Just doing the dances you learned years ago won't help your brain motor cortex stay in shape. To keep the mind alive requires learning something truly new with intense focus. That is what will allow you to both lay down new memories and have a system that can easily access and preserve the older ones. Okay, I'm going to take that quote. That's a really important quote here. Not for this subsection, but just in general in our document. Merzenich told me everything that you can see happen in a young brain can happen in an older brain. The only requirement is that the person must have enough of a reward or punishment to keep paying attention through what might otherwise be a boring training session. If so, he says, the changes can be every bit as great as the changes in a newborn. Okay. Adults do exercises that refine their ability to hear in a way they haven't since they were in the crib, trying to separate out mother's voice from background noise. The exercises increase processing speed. Okay, so this is the fast for this is for fast forward. Yeah. Am I supposed to pronounce this as fast forward? I think it's just fast forward. The exercises increase processing speed and make basic signals stronger, sharper, and more accurate while stimulating the brain to produce the dopamine and acetylcholine. So we need to make sure that we verify whether or not this has been refuted since then, since this book came out. Oh, we're moving. All right. It is reasonable to ask whether our... Okay, we're getting into sexual plasticity here. Uh-oh. Research has shown that neuroplasticity is neither... I don't even know what this word's going to mean here. Within certain departments in the brain or confined to the sensory, motor, and cognitive processing areas we have already explored. The brain structure that regulates instinctive behaviors, including sex, called the hypothalamus, is plastic, as is the amygdala, the structure that processes emotion and anxiety. While some parts of the brain, such as the cortex, may have more plastic potential because there are more neurons and connections to be altered, even non-cortical areas display plasticity. It is a property of all brain tissue. Plasticity exists in the hippocampus, the area that turns our memories from short-term to long-term ones, as well as in areas that control our breathing, process primitive sensation, and process pain. Let's gank that. That's a huge quote. It exists in the spinal cord, as scientists have shown. Okay. Cruising. All right, dopamine, as we saw in Merzenich's work, is also involved in plastic change. The same surge of dopamine that thrills us also consolidates the neuronal connections responsible for the behaviors that led us to accomplish our goal. When Merzenich used an electrode to stimulate an animal's dopamine reward system while playing a sound, dopamine release stimulated plastic change, enlarging the representation for the sound in the animal's auditory map. Okay. I don't think we should be talking about this stuff here. All right, we're just getting into we're getting into some explicit topics here. I'm going to just say addictive material. Addictive material is more exciting than satisfying because we have two separate pleasure systems in our brain, one that has to do with exciting pleasure and one with satisfying pleasure. Exciting and satisfying. The exciting system relates to the appetite of pleasure that we get imagining something we desire. Its neurochemistry is largely dopamine related, and it raises our tension level. The second pleasure system has to do with the satisfaction or consumatory pleasure that attends that thing that we are excited for. A calming, fulfilling pleasure. Its neurochemistry is based on the release of endorphins, which are related to opiates and give a peaceful, euphoric bliss. Okay. So the interesting thing about this addictive behavior is specifically that it's like a good example of addictive behavior. Like it's a good example of something that we are going to discuss quite broadly as we're learning how to break the most unbreakable habits and learning how to skirt the trajectory into such habits, right? All right, clearly there was something about Thomas's sexuality outside of his awareness that had suddenly surfaced. Does the net simply reveal quirks and kinks, or does it also help create them? Okay. I think it creates new fantasies out of the aspect, blah, 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 that have been outside of the surfer's conscious awareness, bringing these elements together to form new networks. Right. Okay. In 1950, pleasure centers were discovered in the limbic system as part of the brain's heavily involved, a part of the brain heavily involved in processing emotion, limbic system that is. In Dr. Robert Health's experiments on humans, an electrode was implanted into the septal region of the limbic system and turned on. These patients experienced a euphoria so powerful that when the researchers tried to end the experiment, one patient pleaded with them not to. So this is like Black Mirror stuff. The septal region also fired when pleasant subjects were discussed with the patients and during sex. These pleasure centers were found to be part of the brain's reward system, the mesolimbic dopamine system. In 1954, James Old and Peter Milner showed that when they inserted electrodes into an animal's pleasure center while teaching it a task, it learned more easily because learning felt so pleasurable and was so rewarded. That's kind of wild. When the pleasure centers are turned on, everything we experience gives us pleasure. A drug like cocaine acts on us by lowering the threshold at which our pleasure centers will fire, making it easier for them to turn on. It is not simply the cocaine that gives us pleasure. It is the fact that our pleasure centers now fire so easily that makes whatever we experience feel greater. It is not just the cocaine that can lower the threshold at which our pleasure centers fire. When people with bipolar disorder, formerly called manic depression, begin to move toward their manic highs, their pleasure centers begin firing more easily. And falling in love also lowers the threshold at which the pleasure centers will fire. So you should do a lot of learning when you're falling in love. You should have a book handy with you. When a person gets high on cocaine, becomes manic, or falls in love, he enters in an enthusiastic state and is optimistic about everything because all three conditions lower the firing threshold for the appetitive pleasure system, the dopamine based system associated with the pleasure of anticipating something we desire. The addict, the manic, and the lover are increasingly filled with hopeful anticipation and are sensitive to anything that might give pleasure. Flowers and fresh air inspire them, and a slight but thoughtful gesture makes them delight in all mankind. Okay. All right, love creates a generous state of mind because love allows. Okay, blah, blah, blah. The science of unlearning is a very new one. Because plasticity is competitive when a person develops a neural network, it becomes efficient and self sustaining and, like a habit, hard to unlearn. Different chemistries are involved in learning than in unlearning. When we learn something new, neurons fire together and wire together, and a chemical process occurs at the neuronal level called long-term potentiation, which strengthens the connections between the neurons. When the brain unlearns associations and disconnects neurons, another chemical process occurs called long-term depression, which has nothing to do with the depressed mood or state. Unlearning and weakening connections between neurons is just as plastic a process and just as important as learning and strengthening them. If we only strengthen connections, our neuronal networks would get saturated. Evidence suggests that unlearning existing memories is necessary to make room for new memories in our networks. So I want to just grab this. Because this is something we don't need to know this in part 1, but we do need to know this for sure in part 2. Neuromodulators are different from neurotransmitters. While neurotransmitters are released in the so neuromodulators are anatomically the same thing as neurotransmitters. Like it's the same molecules. Like dopamine can be a neurotransmitter and a neuromodulator. This is describing its role in the system here. So while neurotransmitters are released in the synapses to excite or inhibit neurons, neuromodulators enhance or diminish the overall effectiveness of the synaptic connections and bring about enduring change. Freeman believes that when we so imagine, like, I think this is how it works. Imagine that dopamine can be transferred as a neurotransmitter and then released at a certain point diffusely in an area, and now it's acting as a neuromodulator. Freeman believes that when we commit in love, the brain neuromodulator oxytocin is released, allowing existing neuronal connections to melt away so that changes on a large scale can follow. Okay. Wow, that's crazy. You fall in love and you just start forgetting things? Jeez. Whereas dopamine induces excitement, puts us into high gear, and triggers sexual arousal, oxytocin induces a calm, warm mood that increases tender feelings and attachment and may lead us to lower our guard. A recent study shows that oxytocin also triggers trust. When people sniff oxytocin and then participate in a financial game, they are more prone to trust others with their money. Though there is still more work to be done on oxytocin in humans, evidence suggests that its effect is similar to that in prairie voles. It makes us commit to our partners and devotes us to our children. Okay. Oxytocin's ability to wipe out learned behavior has led scientists to call it an amnestic hormone. And okay, the other thing about neuromodulators and hormones. I believe hormones are, it's the same molecules, just hormones is that they're within the broader body and I guess blood, and they can only act as neuromodulators, obviously, in the brain when they're being released in that specific way, or it's for that specific process. So although like serotonin gets produced in like the gut, or a lot of it does, that can reach the brain and then operate as a neuromodulator. Freeman proposes that oxytocin melts down existing neuronal connections that underlie existing attachments so new attachments can be formed. Oxytocin in this theory does not teach parents to parent, nor does it make lovers cooperate and kind. Rather, it makes it possible for them to learn new patterns. Okay. There's some dispute over the idea that oxytocin is solely responsible for this new burst of learning, for changes in our existing attachment, or how it might facilitate these changes. Neuroscientists Zark Panskip argues that oxytocin, in combination with other brain chemicals, is so overwhelmingly good at reducing our feeling of separation distress that the pain of losing previous attachment makes less eminent impression than it would otherwise. The relative lack of distress may also free us to learn new things, form new bonds, while partially reconfiguring our existing relationship. Okay. Plasticity allows us to develop brains so unique in response to our individual life experiences that it is often hard to see the world as others do, to want what they want, or to cooperate. But the successful reproduction of our species requires cooperation. What nature provides in a neuromodulator like oxytocin is the ability for two brains in love to go through a period of heightened plasticity, allowing them to mold to each other and shape each other's intentions and perceptions. The brain for Freeman is fundamentally an organ of socialization. And so there must be a mechanism that from time to time undergoes our tendency to become overly individualized. So this is actually something that we might want to put in here. I'm going to just gank this whole thing and throw it in here. And just say the brain that changes itself, because that's huge. That's a huge point. Okay. Unlearning in love allows us to change our image of ourselves for the better if we have an adoring partner, but it also helps account for our vulnerability when we fall in love, and explains why so many self-possessed young men and women who fall in love with a manipulative, undermining, or devaluing person often lose all sense of self and become plagued with self-doubt, from which it may take years to recover. That's terrifying. Berzenich's colleague, Nancy Beil, who works in physical medicine, teaches people who can't control their fingers to redifferentiate their finger maps. The trick is not to try to move the fingers separately, but to relearn how to use their hands the way they did as babies. When treating guitarists with focal dystonias who have lost control of their fingers, for example, she first instructs them to stop playing guitar for a while to weaken the merged map. Then they just hold an unstrung guitar for a few days. Then a single string with a different feel from a normal guitar string is put on the guitar, and they feel it carefully, but with only one finger. Finally, they use a second finger on a separate string. Eventually, the fused brain maps for their fingers separate into two distinct maps, and they can play again. Wow. All right. As for the patients who became involved in porn, most were able to go cold turkey once they understood the problem and how they were plastically reinforcing it. They found eventually that they were attracted once again to their mates. None of these men had addictive personalities or serious childhood traumas. And when they understood what was happening to them, they stopped using their computers for a period to weaken their problematic neuronal networks, and their appetite withered away. Okay. Yeah, I think that this whole section was actually following a case study on someone that was addicted to that. Very nice, right? Okay. Midnight Resurrections. Oh, I think this was particularly interesting. Or maybe not if I didn't. Okay. Based on his work on plasticity, Taub has discovered a number of training principles. Training is more effective if the skill closely relates to everyday life. Training should be done in increments, and work should be concentrated into a short time. A training technique Taub calls massed practice, which he has found far more effective than long-term but less frequent training. This is a huge deal. Like more frequent, shorter practices being more effective than less frequent long-term. Okay, we're off again. Brain lock unlocked. Using plasticity to stop worries, obsessions, compulsions, and bad habits. There's got to be something in here, right? Oh, okay. Causes of severe OCD brain lock vary. In many cases, it runs in families and may be genetic. I don't think you could use maybe that way. But it can also be caused by infections that swell the caudate. And as we shall see, learning also plays a role in its development. Schwartz set out to develop a treatment that would change the OCD circuit by unlocking the link between the orbital cortex and the cingulate and normalizing the functioning of the caudate. Schwartz wondered whether patients could shift the caudate manually by paying constant, effortful attention and actively focusing on something besides the worry, such as a new pleasurable activity. This approach makes plastic sense because it grows a new brain circuit that gives pleasure and triggers dopamine release, which, as we have seen, rewards the new activity and consolidates and grows new neuronal connections. This new circuit can eventually compete with the older one, and according to use it or lose it, the pathological networks will weaken. With this treatment, we don't so much break bad habits as replace bad behaviors with better ones. Schwartz divides the therapy into a number of steps, of which two are key. The first is for a person having an OCD attack to relabel what is happening to him so that he realizes that what he is experiencing is not an attack of germs, AIDS, or battery acid, but an episode of OCD. They should remember that brain lock occurs in the three parts of the brain. As a therapist, I encourage OCD patients to make the following summary for themselves. Yes, I do have a problem right now, but it is not germs, it is my OCD. This relabeling allows them to get some distance from the content of the obsession and view it in somewhat the same way Buddhists view suffering in meditation. They observe its effects on them and so slightly separate themselves from it. Wow. The OCD patient should also remind themselves that the reason the attack doesn't go away immediately is the faulty circuit. Some patients may find it helpful in the midst of an attack to look at the pictures of the abnormal OCD brain scan in Schwartz's book, Brain Lock, and compare it with the more normal brain scans that Schwartz's patients developed with treatment to remind themselves it is possible to change circuits. Pretty cool. Yeah, it's like, even though we can think that we could be like certain that neuroplasticity exists without seeing that proof. It's hard to tell how much you can change. Like we always, so this is going back to, you know, everything we talked about in part 1. We always have that feeling of certainty when we think about the world, and we don't ever realize how much our understanding of the world changes over time. And so when we feel really adamant about what we believe in the moment, it's hard for us to really appreciate how fleeting that understanding might be. I have brain lock. I'm not even sure I've never heard of brain lock, but maybe this book would be pretty effective. That said, the book I'm reading came out in 2007. This book must have come out earlier. I wouldn't recommend that book. I would recommend a newer book. There's probably a newer book. How's it going? Embrace primalism. What is poppin'? After a patient has acknowledged that the worry is a symptom of OCD, the next crucial step is to refocus on a positive, wholesome, ideally pleasure-giving activity the moment he becomes aware that they are having an OCD attack. The activity could be gardening, helping someone, working on a hobby, playing a musical instrument, listening to music, working out, or shooting baskets. An activity that involves another person helps keep the patient focused. If OCD strikes while the patient is driving a car, they should be ready with an activity like a book on tape or a CD. It is essential to do something, to shift the gear manually. So I'm guessing this is like with any addictive habit. I imagine you want to get this going right away. Like you want to spend a lot of effort focusing on something that you would enjoy. That's not the thing that's trying to pull you in. It's going strange. How about you? That's pretty run-of-the-mill, but also that means there's just a lot going on. A lot to do. Just trying to get through it. Each moment they spend thinking of the symptom, believing that germs are threatening to them, they deepen the obsessive circuit. By bypassing it, they are on the road to losing it. With obsessions and compulsions, the more you do it, the more you want to do it. The less you do it, the less you want to do it. Schwartz has found it essential to understand that it is not what you feel while applying the technique that counts. It is what you do. The struggle is not to make the feeling go away. The struggle is not to give in to the feeling by acting out a compulsion or thinking about the obsession. This technique won't give immediate relief because lasting neuroplastic change takes time, but it does lay the groundwork for change by exercising the brain in a new way. So at first, one will still feel both the urge to enact the compulsion and the tension and anxiety that come from resisting it. The goal is to change the channel to some new activity for 15 to 30 minutes when one has an OCD symptom. If one cannot resist that long, any time spent resisting is beneficial, even if it is only for a minute. That resistance, that effort, is what appears to lay down new circuits. Wow. I have those kinds of feelings when I have schoolwork and needing to wash my hands a lot. I am pathologized. Yeah, I guess it's tough with schoolwork, like, because that's like something you have to do, right? So that, like, I imagine what you're talking about is like a different type of thing, but ideally there's a way to go about it in such a way where you make it feel more fun, right? And I'm not saying like it should feel more fun right now. It's like, is there some cool strategy where you can literally like hijack your brain into thinking that the work is fun? And like that is hopefully where education is going. That's where this document's going, in the sense that we're trying to figure out how we can strategically direct our brain so that what we find to be daunting tasks aren't daunting tasks anymore. So that we just do what we think we ought to do. That's more part 3, but that's going to be the goal. Okay. In chapter 3, redesigning the brain, we learn 2 key laws of plasticity that also underlie this treatment. The first is that neurons that fire together wire together. By doing something pleasurable in place of the compulsion, patients form a new circuit that is gradually reinforced instead of the compulsion. The second law is that neurons that fire apart wire apart. By not acting on their compulsions, patients weaken the link between the compulsion and the idea it will ease their anxiety. This delinking is crucial because, as we've seen, while acting on a compulsion eases anxiety in the short term, it worsens OCD in the long term. Schwartz has had good results with severe cases. 80% of his patients get better when they use his method in combination with medicine, typically an antidepressant such as anafranil or Prozac type drug. I imagine we got better stuff than that now. Okay, pain, the dark side of plasticity. Yikes. All right, we're over halfway done. We're an hour 30 in. Let's see how much more we could do. Hopefully we could finish by tomorrow, and then actually, I'm not going to be on tomorrow. Hopefully we could finish by Wednesday. We finish up, taking tomorrow off. Wednesday we finish this. Thursday we get astrology day. We're going to have to see what's going on there. And then we're chilling on Friday. Actually, we're not chilling on Friday. Ooh, I'm not going to be here Friday. All right, so nothing there, nothing there. Might be back for Sunday. And then we got a week, holiday break. And then I'll be back. Straight chilling. So this is all we have left, these 2 weeks, for the topic of the context of you. I think that's the month's topic. Just like considering differences of people. That said, the idea isn't to write a draft of each of these sections now. It's really to just kind of immerse myself into the topic and then consider what I should still have to look into. What are my goals with these ventures? Well, the goal is to, there's a bunch of goals going on here. I guess the first, the most immediate goal, and when I say immediate, I don't mean high priority, but the most immediate goal is, by building out this document, I'm essentially forcing myself to learn a lot, and better yet, to organize all this information into a way that makes sense, where now I can easily learn new information because I'm able to associate to what's already in there, but also I can teach it easily. That's the goal. I want to be able to teach this easily. Now, also, this thing is just sitting here. It's a public document. Anyone can look into it, and it's useful. I think that's the goal, for it to be useful. But the goal of the document is obviously to learn to determine a path for life. So this is something I want to do as well. I want to figure out, okay, how should I go about my life? I've got some ideas about how this is going to probably look, and that's what I've been following, which has actually led me here. But we have to put in the work to actually make this legit. Now that's that's the immediate goal, right? The document. The broader goal is to overall help the most amount of people that we possibly can. I'm a utilitarian at some point. My moral framework has led me to thinking that this pursuit is probably the thing that gives me the best outcome, in terms of not only being able to educate in some way, but people are going to be able to get this content. I'm going to have to try to make this content more palatable in YouTube and short form and all that stuff. And that'll work. And then the big goal is for this channel to blow up, and then I become an influencer of positive change. Epic save the world. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a save the world situation. It's just maximizing outcomes. It's, even if the world is going down, if we can reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering that people have to deal with, then that's a positive outcome. And it's significantly more positive than if I were to just do nothing, right? If I were to just play video games every day, which I kind of would love to do, that would be a lot of fun. yeah, the difference of outcome would be so different. Okay. What are my goals? Do I ever consider theoretical physics? No, I don't know how much practicality would be in that, and I don't think I'm good enough to actually get something, to find something that would be so practical and earth shattering. Hopefully not actually earth shattering, but so in my mind, this is like the optimal pursuit. It's like, I have to learn a lot of stuff, and not only learn it, but like be able to teach it. So I have to learn it in that way, and I need to grow a community. Hopefully, we at some point monetize in some way. We can give a lot of that to charity. That's a huge deal, because like the only thing that competes with doing this whole pursuit is some pursuit where I try to make as much money as I possibly can throughout my life and just donate it. Like that could also compete for the best outcome, right? Um, because especially when especially charities that specifically involve parts of the world that are significantly less wealthy than the U.S. You can do a lot of change with very little money. So like that's what I would do otherwise. But that seems so lame, just to like spend my entire life just trying to make money just to do that. Even though it would be great, it would be noble, but it would not be as engaging, or I wouldn't be able to help anyone like more directly. Like if there was a person in front of me, I wouldn't be able to give him what I could give him now after having done this for a year. And actually, how long have I been going here? A year and a half. So yeah, this seems like the perfect thing for me to do right now, to just get absolutely cracked at these issues, and hopefully to build a love what you're doing, man. Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind words. But yeah, it's going to be a long process, right? Like we planned out the entire next year. We have a roadmap for every single month's topic that we are kind of trying to go deep diving in. And there's so many there's just so many things to talk about that we're not even going to be able to do this effectively. Like the what makes you unique topic is so large that it's a little inappropriate that we're not going to be able to get done with it. But all these topics are huge. January, attention and focus. February, biases and habits. I don't know if this is going to be specifically breaking habits. Actually, yeah, this would be literally breaking habits now. Leveraging what we've learned in the previous. Then we're doing meditation for fun, and anything that's associated with meditation here. I think that's what I meant with and friends. We've got thinking. April is all going to be about thinking. Rationality. We got logical fallacies and stuff going on here. Discussion about truth. What is a good reason? Stuff like that. Universals and particulars. How to use LLMs for thinking. Like this is, I think, fun stuff we got coming down the pipeline. Determining where to go. So now we're like talking about, like, if you have a goal, like what, actually, no, I think this is choosing your goals. Like what goals would you, do you choose and why? Like at a really fundamental level, not at like the part 3 level yet. We got the art and science of goal making, of goal setting. Framing, we got, which I think is going to be moved higher. I think framing is actually like a topic that deserves to be up top. Learning and acquiring skills. We got habit and routine. So maybe this is where we talk about habits in a more, I don't know, a more thorough way. I'm not sure. The social environment and okay, and then this is going to kind of put everything together. But that's a whole year, and then we have to get into part 3 stuff, and we're not even going to be at the at the point where we are at with part 1 of the document, where part 1 is pretty much largely drafted. It's going to take a while for us to get there with part 2, and then obviously part 3 is going to part 3 might be quicker than part 2. I would say that it's very noble and righteous, yet I do not have a metric by which such terms can be denoted. Right. Yeah. I mean, people are going to think different things about those words. But yeah, let's see what we could do. I mean, this is kind of like let's see what we can do here. Let's see what we can accomplish. Let's see what the community can become. You know, I've never been a leader of a huge community before, so let's just see what happens. You know, I hope to take feedback at every step of the way, so that hopefully I don't have to do Hell the New Renaissance, so that I don't have to do all the executive thinking myself. Hopefully people can come up with good ideas and good feedback, so that we crowdsource this thing. That would be nice. That would put a lot off of my plate. Okay, where are we going here? Back there. All right. 141. All right, let's keep going. All right, pain and body image are closely related. We always experience pain as projected into the body. When you throw your back out, you say, my back is killing me, and not my pain system is killing me. But as phantoms show, we don't need a body part or even pain receptors to feel pain. We need a body image produced by our brain maps. People with actual limbs don't usually realize this, because the body images of our limbs are perfectly projected onto our actual limbs, making it impossible to distinguish our body image from our body. Your own body is a phantom, says Ramachandran, one that your brain has constructed purely for convenience. I don't know if it's appropriate to say that it's one your brain is constructed for convenience. You know, obviously it's more apt to say that it's your brain constructs it because of like evolution. But then we could try to interpret it, why it constructs it now. And it's more for homeostasis or autopoiesis, which Energy Donter brought up earlier. It helps you react to pain, you know? So like when you feel like your foot is hurting, you know where to look to solve that problem. Distorted body images are common and demonstrate that there is a difference between the body image and the body itself. Anorexics experience their bodies as fat when they are on the edge of starvation. People with distorted body images, a condition called body dysmorphic disorder, can experience a part of the body that is perfectly within the norm as defective. They think their ears, nose, lips, breasts, all right, we're getting into sexual organs now, or thighs are too large or too small or just wrong, and they feel tremendous shame. Marilyn Monroe experienced herself as having many bodily defects. Such people often seek plastic surgery but still feel mishappen after their operations. What they need instead is a neuroplastic surgery to change their body image. I guess, okay, we go into that stuff. According to Ramachandran, pain, like the body image, is created by the brain and projected onto the body. This assertion is contrary to common sense in the traditional neurological view of pain that says that when we are hurt, our pain receptors send a one-way signal to the brain's pain center, and that the intensity of pain perceived is proportional to the seriousness of the injury. We assume that pain always files an accurate damage report. This traditional view dates back to the philosopher Descartes, who saw the brain as a passive recipient of pain. The brain as a passive recipient of pain. But that view was overturned in 1965 when neuroscientist Melzack and Wall wrote the most important article in the history of pain. They asserted that the pain system is spread throughout the body and spinal cord, and far from being a passive recipient of pain, the brain always controls the pain signals we feel. Right? And this is how expert meditators can, meditate through a significant amount of you know, I would say pain, but it's not necessarily pain for them because they've trained their brain to be able to not even really care about that pain, or care about what would otherwise be pain. So their gate control theory of pain proposed a series of controls or gates between the site of injury and the brain. When pain messages are sent from damaged tissue through the nervous system, they pass through several gates starting in the spinal cord before they get to the brain. But these messages travel only if the brain gives them permission after determining they are important enough to be let through. So this is like top-down attention which actually affects like whether or not signals in a certain area are let through. But yeah, I guess it could also be bottom-up attention that it competes for your attention in a sense, without your wanting it. Obviously, you might want to top down, not want the pain, and imagine you're not a trained meditator and you're trying to outthink the pain, and your brain's just not ready to do that. You haven't strengthened that. That's why meditation it requires you to do a ton, because you're strengthening these parts of your brain that allows you to exert top-down attention to actually compete against your more automatic brain systems. If permission is granted, a gate will open and increase the feeling of pain by allowing certain neurons to turn on and transmit their signals. The brain can also close a gate and block the pain signal by releasing endorphins, the narcotics made by the body to quell pain. The gate theory made sense of all sorts of pain experiences. For instance, when the U.S. troops landed in Italy in World War II, 70% of the men who were seriously wounded reported that they were not in pain and did not want painkillers. Men wounded on the battlefield often don't feel pain and keep fighting. It's as if the brain closes the gate to keep the embattled soldier's attention riveted on how to get out of harm's way. Only when he is safe are the pain signals allowed to pass to the brain. It's pretty wild. Physicians have long known that a patient who expects to get pain relief from a pill often does, even though it is a placebo containing no medication. fMRI brain scans show that during the placebo effect, the brain turns down its own pain-responsive regions. When a mother soothes her hurt child by stroking and talking sweetly to it, she is helping the child's brain turn down the volume on its pain. How much pain we feel is determined in significant part by our brains and our minds, our current mood, our past experiences of pain, our psychology, and how serious we think our injury is. Perhaps that's why we shouldn't look at it. Extending the gate theory, Ramachandran developed his next idea that pain is a complex system under the plastic brain's control. He summed this up as follows: pain is an opinion on the organism's state of health rather than a mere reflexive response to injury. The brain gathers evidence from many sources before triggering pain. He has also said that pain is an illusion, and that our mind is a virtual reality machine which experiences the world indirectly and processes it at one remove, constructing a model in our head. So and this book came out a while back before predictive processing was a huge deal, where like these types of framings are actually quite common now, that our brain is expecting rather than showing us what truly is in some way. When we guard, we prevent our muscles from moving and aggravating our injury. If we had to remind ourselves consciously not to move, we'd become exhausted and slip up, hurt ourselves, and feel pain. Now suppose, thought Ramachandran, the brain preempts the mistaken movement by triggering pain the moment before the movement takes place, between the time when the motor center issues the command to move and the time when the move is performed. What better way for the brain to prevent movement than to make sure the motor command itself triggers pain? Ramachandran came to believe that in these chronic pain patients, the motor command got wired into the pain system so that even though the limb had healed, when the brain sent out a motor command to move the arm, it still triggered pain. Ramachandran called this learned pain and wondered whether the mirror box could help relieve it. All right, so yeah, I mean, this is just also pointing out how, you know, the brain can learn to predict in that way, to cause pain when before something actually happens, but also when the limb had already been healed. Okay, what do we have? In India, Ramachandran grew up in a world where many things that seemed fantastic to Westerners were commonplace. He knew about yogis who here we go. He knew about yogis who relieved suffering with meditation and walked barefoot across hot coals or lay down on nails. He saw religious people in trances putting needles through their chins. The idea that living things change their forms was widely accepted. The power of the mind to influence the body was taken for granted, and illusion was seen as so fundamental a force that it was represented in the deity Maya, the goddess of illusion. He had transposed a sense of wonder from the streets of India to Western neurology, and his work inspires questions that mingle the two. What is a trance but a closing down of the gates of pain within us? Why should we think phantom pain any less real than ordinary pain? And he has reminded us that great science can still be done with elegant simplicity. Nice. Okay, maybe I call it here, and then we continue on Wednesday. Hopefully we finish up on Wednesday, and then we can look at that Gemini research for what has come out since this book. That's kind of what I'm curious about, because I read this book, and now we're just going through my highlights, not even my notes, but my highlights. I want to know what's happened since this book in this topic. Like, what have we discovered in terms of neuroplasticity? And even though that's not technically in this month, it kind of opens us up to all the part 2 contents. Because what we're trying to do in part 2 is like, what can we deliberately do right now that will affect how we think about the world in the future? And so we have to deal with neuroplasticity as like a fundamental topic here. Powerful Stan, thank you. All right, thanks for chilling. Thanks for the positive vibes. And yeah, have a good rest of the day, everyone.